She never imagined her life could take such an unexpected turn. Working as a waitress in a modest diner on the outskirts of Chicago, 25-year-old Claire Matthews believed she knew exactly where her future was heading. Struggling each month to pay rent, saving up pennies for college classes, and dreaming of a better life. Yet one evening a mysterious customer in a tailored Brioni suit began leaving lavish tips and flashing a smile that hinted at a hidden fortune. Despite her co-workers' excited whispers that he was a millionaire, Claire dismissed his flirtation as nothing more than a game. Little did she know, destiny had something far more dramatic in store. Claire Matthews had long grown accustomed to the daily bustle of Rosie's Diner, a small eatery tucked between a hardware store and a laundromat in a quiet Chicago neighborhood. She had started working there right after high school, juggling the constant demands of customers while dreaming about the kind of life she saw in glossy magazines. Each morning, she would slip on her slightly worn uniform, tie her blonde hair back with a rubber band, and force a bright smile on her face, fully aware that tips were her lifeline. Growing up, Claire had learned to be self-sufficient. Her mother, Linda Matthews, worked nights as a nurse at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, while her father had left them when Claire was just 5. From a young age, she took care of her younger sister Megan, boiling instant noodles for dinner and helping with homework. Claire's mother did her best, but constant double shifts took their toll. As a result, Claire had developed a fierce sense of independence. She had a plan, save every spare dollar enroll in part-time college courses, and one day become a teacher, an aspiration she held close to her heart. Despite her limited means, Claire's biggest treasure was her innate optimism. She believed in kindness and hard work. She did her best to be polite to every customer, whether it was a snappy retiree complaining about slightly burnt toast, or a pair of construction workers who joked endlessly while wolfing down burgers. Her genuine sweetness not only earned her regular tips, but also made her popular among locals. Friends and co-workers alike admired Claire's unshakable drive. Still, there were nights she felt like life was passing her by. On weekends, social media was flooded with images of her peers hanging out at trendy clubs downtown, wearing designer outfits and sipping on fancy cocktails. When she scrolled through Instagram and saw her old classmates, people like Sarah Nicholson, who had gone on to graduate from the University of Chicago and landed a corporate job at Morgan Stanley, Claire felt a pang of longing, but she quickly reminded herself, hard work, patience, and determination would pay off eventually. What set her world into motion was the arrival of a solitary customer who seemed entirely out of place at Rosie's Diner. One Tuesday afternoon, Claire noticed him stepping out of a sleek black Tesla parked along the curb. Despite the diner's humble interior, he looked perfectly at ease in his expensive suit, the kind of attire she had only ever glimpsed in the windows of high-end boutiques on the Magnificent Mile. He casually took a seat at a corner booth and ordered a simple cup of coffee and a slice of apple pie. In that moment, she felt an odd thrill, an inexplicable sense that her life was about to change. But she had no idea how drastically. That day, the man introduced himself simply as Alexander. Over time, she would discover his real name, his carefully guarded secrets, and realize that the line between game and sincerity can be impossibly blurred. On the outside, Alexander Wyatt had everything a person could want: wealth, success, and a reputation for strategic genius in the world of business. At just 31 years old, he had already co-founded a tech startup that was bought out by a major player for several $1 million. Subsequently, he built a reputable investment firm with offices not only in Chicago, but also in New York and Los Angeles. He frequented exclusive events, took meetings with brand executives, and made decisions that shaped budding companies. Press articles alternately hailed him as the next Mark Cuban and a modern-day mogul. Yet underneath his polished surface, Alexander was deeply lonely. Despite the boardroom accomplishments, late-night parties at posh lounges and champagne toasts with celebrities, there was always a hollow feeling in his chest. Growing up in a humble household in Detroit, his family had constantly struggled. Both of his parents worked 2 jobs each, leaving him to fend for himself. He vowed early in life that he would never return to that precarious existence, and it fueled his obsession with success. But as he inched closer to the pinnacle of material comfort, he found himself drifting away from what made him truly happy. This inner turmoil led him one breezy afternoon to walk into Rosie's Diner. He had been driving through Chicago's outskirts to clear his head, feeling an uncharacteristic urge to reconnect with the simpler things. Alexander often found solace in unassuming places away from the cunning associates and superficial acquaintances, always vying for a piece of his fortune. In Rosie's Diner, he believed he might find a piece of normalcy, a fleeting moment untouched by the constant demands of wealth. He first laid eyes on Claire Matthews when she hurried over to take his order. In a plain uniform and sporting a tired but warm smile, she radiated sincerity that contrasted sharply with the plastic niceties he endured in his usual social circles. Her hair, although loosely gathered, still managed to highlight her soft features. The directness in her gaze, both curious and guarded, stirred something inside him. As he sipped his coffee, black with no sugar, and tasted a forkful of apple pie, he found himself drawn in by her genuine aura. It wasn't just her prettiness. There was an unmistakable integrity that shone through. In wealthy circles, he had learned to guard himself, always questioning people's motives. Yet in that small booth with fluorescent lights and checkered floors, he could momentarily forget about the constant manipulation and see humanity at its simplest. Alexander returned the next day, and the day after that, ordering variations of the daily specials and leaving generous tips that made Claire uneasy. She was grateful but also wondered if he was simply showing off. She assumed quite naturally that a man like that couldn't possibly be interested in her beyond a flirtatious game. A man in a Brioni suit exchanging small talk with a waitress in a worn apron was far too surreal an image. Little did Claire know that Alexander's decision to return repeatedly was spurred by more than the diner's nostalgic feel. Each time he asked her a question about her day or how her classes were going, little details he'd gleaned from overhearing her talk to co-workers. He noticed her stoic determination, the dark circles under her eyes that betrayed fatigue, and something else, an unwavering spark of hope. In a world where financial success was touted as the ultimate measure of a person's worth, Alexander was shocked that a woman as captivating as Claire would in turn meet his glances with caution. In that delicate dynamic, he felt the first fluttering of something real, a chance at genuine connection that was rarer than all the fortunes he had amassed. In the weeks that followed, Alexander became a familiar sight at Rosie's Diner. The regulars started to whisper among themselves, and Claire's co-workers couldn't help but tease her. Even Rosie herself, Rosie Nicholson, the middle-aged owner of the diner, began to tease Claire whenever the polished stranger took his seat in the corner booth. An amiable woman, Rosie believed wholeheartedly in romance and enjoyed playing the matchmaker role, if only in jest. Claire brushed off the teasing with a shy laugh, but deep down she was grappling with the sudden upheaval in her life's monotony. She found Alexander fascinating. He seemed genuinely curious about her aspirations and was surprisingly humble, especially for someone who carried himself with such confidence. On slow afternoons, when the lunch rush had died down, she would stop by his table to chat. He'd ask about her favorite authors, or how she balanced her part-time college classes with full-time work. At first, she offered guarded, polite responses, unsure if she could trust his attention, but gradually, she allowed herself to be more open. One Wednesday, she mentioned almost offhandedly that she had a mid-term exam in her evening class. Alexander seemed genuinely interested, even offering a few motivational words. It was a small kindness, but it touched Claire. At the end of his meal, instead of leaving a tip on the table, he handed her a small envelope, urging her not to open it until after work. Startled, she slid it into her apron pocket. That entire shift, she was too anxious to think about anything else. When she finally opened the envelope after work, her breath caught in her throat. Inside was a note on fine stationery reading, "Go ace that exam." Along with a neatly folded $200. Claire felt her knees wobble in astonishment. She had never received such a gesture. Part of her felt thrilled. Another part bristled in self-consciousness. She didn't want to be seen as a charity case. She remembered how her father had walked away from the family after the money got tight, leaving her mother to struggle alone. Claire never wanted to feel indebted or beholden to anyone. The next day, she mustered the courage to return the money, or at least to talk to Alexander about it. She found him seated in his usual spot, casually scrolling through news on his phone. Heart pounding, she approached and slid the envelope across the table, her voice shaky yet firm. "I can't accept this," she said. "I appreciate the support, but it's too much." He paused, meeting her gaze with a look of genuine concern. It wasn't meant to be too much. It was just a little help. "I believe in you, and I know how tough juggling work and school can be." Feeling a surge of conflicting emotions, gratitude, embarrassment, and a faint flicker of trust, she pushed the envelope back toward him. "I'll consider it a loan," she insisted. "I can't just take it." Alexander studied her expression for a moment, then nodded gently. "A loan it is," he acquiesced. That single word sealed a quiet agreement between them, a promise that neither of them could fully define. One thing was clear from that point on: the simple role of waitress and customer would be forever altered. As the weeks turned into a couple of months, Claire and Alexander's interactions became more frequent, edging ever closer to genuine friendship. Beneath the bright fluorescent lights of the diner, over countless coffee refills, they shared bits of their worlds. Claire learned that Alexander had studied computer science at the University of Michigan and had dropped out in his junior year to work on a startup. She was amazed at how easily he talked about seizing opportunity, yet she sensed an undercurrent of restlessness in his tone. Alexander, in turn, discovered that Claire's mother was still a night shift nurse, and that her younger sister Megan struggled with a chronic health issue. Claire mentioned it in passing, describing how she often stayed up late researching better treatments and alternative therapies. Though she never complained, Alexander sensed the stress beneath her calm exterior. He found her strength admirable. Here was a woman who refused to complain or ask for help, even when the weight of her responsibilities piled up. Still, Claire had her suspicions. She couldn't shake off the notion that Alexander was far more complicated than he let on. One day, she glimpsed a headline on her phone, a snippet from a Chicago Tribune article referencing Alexander Wyatt's investment firm acquiring yet another tech company. The accompanying photo showed him at a high-profile event, sporting the same understated confidence she saw at the diner. She realized just how big his world truly was, how far removed it seemed from her own. Whispers among the diner's staff became louder. Hadn't they seen his face on magazine covers? Or recognized that name from a local radio interview about successful entrepreneurs? She felt a growing unease, worried that her initial instincts had been correct. Maybe Alexander was just playing a game. All that money, all that success. Who was she to believe it was anything but idle curiosity or a passing fancy? Beyond the diner, Alexander juggled back-to-back meetings, investor negotiations, and philanthropic galas. Yet he found his thoughts drifting to a shy, determined waitress who managed to smile through life's obstacles. He tried telling himself he was just being friendly, that he enjoyed the nostalgia of simpler living. But each evening, when he glanced at his reflection in the tinted windows of his penthouse apartment, he knew better. One night, while sipping scotch in his living room, he got a call from an old friend and business partner, Mark Ellis. They had plans to launch a new venture, and Mark wanted Alexander to wine and dine some prospective clients visiting from Silicon Valley. The event was scheduled at the Signature Room atop the John Hancock Center, a far cry from Rosie's diner. As Mark prattled on about deals and profits, Alexander found his mind wandering to a different scenario. How would Claire react if he invited her to a high-end venue like that? He imagined her shock, her distrust. He felt a pang in his chest, torn between two worlds. That night, as Claire locked up Rosie's diner, she couldn't shake off a gnawing anxiety. Her interactions with Alexander felt like stepping into a fairy tale that risked turning into a cruel joke. Was she just a quaint diversion to him, a fleeting curiosity? The warmth in his eyes seemed so real, yet the harsh reality of their socio-economic gap loomed over them both. With each step she took toward home, her heart waged a silent battle, yearning for that spark he kindled inside her, and fearing the heartbreak that might follow if her worst suspicions proved true. On a particularly rainy Friday evening, the diner was emptier than usual. The hiss of the coffee machine and the faint clatter of utensils were the only sounds filling the quiet gloom. After finishing a plate of fries, Alexander slid out of the booth and approached Claire at the register with a pensive look. "Claire, can I ask you something a bit out of the ordinary?" he said, softly, hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored slacks. She wiped her palms nervously on her apron, bracing herself for whatever was coming next. "Sure," she replied, trying to maintain composure. "I have a business event to attend at the Signature Room tomorrow night." He began, his voice carrying a hint of uncertainty. "It's a formal dinner, and I'd like you to come as my guest." Her heart leapt into her throat. Her mind raced with objections. She had a shift that evening. She didn't own anything fancy. She couldn't possibly mingle with millionaires and corporate executives. Besides, was he doing this just to parade her in front of his associates? I have work," she stammered, though her curiosity flared at the invitation. "I already spoke to Rosie Alexander," said an apologetic smile, tugging at his lips. "She agreed to let you off. And before you protest, it's not about showing off. I'd really like to spend some time with you, outside of the diner." Despite every logical bone in her body telling her to refuse, Claire found herself nodding. Something about Alexander's earnestness in that moment chipped away at her defenses. The next morning, as she stood in the cramped living room of her tiny apartment, rummaging for anything remotely suitable to wear, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Eventually, she settled on a simple black cocktail dress she had thrifted last year for a cousin's wedding. Its modest cut and slightly worn fabric didn't scream luxury, but it was the best she had. She paired it with inexpensive heels, praying they wouldn't stand out. When Alexander arrived in a sleek black Tesla later that evening, she felt a wave of embarrassment, as though every scuff on her shoes was illuminated under the overhead streetlight. But Alexander, stepping out in a charcoal grey suit, only had eyes for her. He smiled in a way that made her heart flutter and opened the passenger door, guiding her gently inside. During the drive downtown, Claire clenched her hands in her lap, nervously watching the city lights blur past. She tried to make small talk, but her anxiety overshadowed the conversation. The signature room, perched high atop the John Hancock building, was a realm of gleaming chandeliers, grand windows overlooking the Chicago skyline, and elegantly dressed patrons. Claire's nerves intensified at the sight of the wealthy crowd. Heads turned as they entered, and she instantly felt out of place. Alexander squeezed her hand, offering a reassuring smile. All throughout dinner, men in sharp suits and women in evening gowns circulated around them. Glasses of champagne, clinked caviar was served, deals were made in hushed tones. Claire tried to keep calm, but as the fancy meal progressed, she felt more aware than ever of the invisible line separating her from Alexander's world. And in the background, she couldn't help but question if it was all just a fleeting thrill for him, a momentary chance to parade a new friend from a modest background in front of his powerful colleagues. Toward the end of the event, after conversations about quarterly profits and venture capital soared overhead, Mark Ellis Alexander's business partner approached. He looked polished in a designer suit, exuding the smooth confidence of a seasoned negotiator. His gaze lingered on Claire longer than she liked, as though trying to piece together why Alexander would bring a waitress from a local diner to such an important gathering. "I don't believe we've met," Mark said politely. "I'm Mark Ellis, co-founder of Wyatt Ellis Investments." He extended a manicured hand. "Claire Matthews?" She responded quietly, shaking his hand. Though she forced a polite smile, she couldn't help but feel his scrutiny. "Matthews, from Rosie's Diner." He continued, half smiling, as if amused. "I've heard Alex mention that place. It's refreshing to meet someone outside of our usual circles." Alexander stepped in, placing a comforting arm around Claire's waist. "Mark," he said, a slight warning in his tone. "Claire's someone special." Mark nodded with a knowing smile, then turned his attention to a group of prospective clients. But Claire couldn't shrug off the subtle condescension she'd sensed in his words. In that moment, she felt more like a trophy or a curiosity than a genuine friend or date. She maintained her composure through the rest of the event, smiling politely when introduced to various corporate bigwigs. She overheard them talking about stock prices, IPOs, their children's private tutors, and exclusive vacation homes. It was a far cry from her world of rent anxieties, second-hand textbooks, and late shifts. The more she felt eyes on her, the more self-conscious she became. Finally, when the event concluded, Alexander led her to a quieter corner near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the dazzling Chicago skyline. The city lights shimmered like constellations, and for a moment they stood side by side, sharing the awe-inspiring view. "You did great tonight," he murmured, slipping off his suit jacket and draping it gently over her shoulders. "I know this must have been uncomfortable." She let out a soft breath, feeling relief wash over her. "It's a lot to take in," she admitted. "Your world is so different. Sometimes I feel like the odd one out." Alexander turned to face her. "I never want you to feel that way. People like Mark might not fully understand, but I do." She met his eyes, scanning them for sincerity. Behind his warm gaze, she sensed not just affection, but a vulnerability that echoed her own. Leaning forward, He hesitated, as though ready to say something important, but at the last moment, the words remained unspoken. Instead, he gently guided her away from the crowd escorting her to the elevator lobby. In the elevator ride, down silence filled the space between them. Claire's mind raced with questions, doubts, and a tender longing she couldn't put into words. She wanted to trust him to believe that his kindness wasn't just a performance. Yet the harsh reality of where she stood in comparison to him gnawed at her. When they stepped out onto the Chicago streets, the crisp night air was a jolt to her senses. Alexander offered to drive her home, but she gently declined, claiming she needed some time to think. He respected her wish, pressing a soft goodbye into her hand and hailing a taxi for her instead. As the cab pulled away, she cast one last glance at him, standing under the flickering streetlight, looking as though he wished he could follow. Claire wondered if she was falling for a fantasy or if just maybe there was a genuine chance that their worlds could coexist after all. After that night, Claire's emotions hovered between a giddy thrill and a nagging sense of dread. Something had definitely shifted between her and Alexander. There was no more denying the chemistry that burned in the space of their shared glances. Even so, she kept her guard up, recalling how easily men could vanish when things got complicated. Her father's departure was a wound that never fully healed, a reminder of broken promises and shattered trust. For his part, Alexander threw himself into work with renewed fervor. He silently worried that by exposing Claire to his high-powered social circles, he might have scared her off. During a meeting at his downtown office, he found himself half listening to a presentation about a new software platform, while his thoughts repeatedly drifted to Claire, the way her eyes had widened at the panoramic view, the faint tremble in her voice when she introduced herself to Mark. Unable to ignore the swirling uncertainties, he called an old confidant, later that week Dr. Yvonne Bradley, his former mentor at the University of Michigan, who had left academia to work as a business consultant. She had known him as a brash, brilliant undergrad, the kid with the big dreams. Over the years, she'd watched him ascend the ladder of success while losing parts of himself along the way. Whenever he felt off balance, he would schedule a call to glean her perspective. Sitting behind his oak desk with the Chicago skyline glittering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Alexander recounted the story of Claire, of his desire to break through to something real and his fear of scaring her. Dr. Bradley listened quietly, then offered a simple yet poignant piece of advice. Be honest with her, Alexander. Let her see the parts of you that no one else does. She may surprise you with her strength. That same evening, Claire found herself pacing around her living room. Megan, her 14-year-old sister, was sprawled on the sofa doing homework. Their mother was at the hospital working a double shift. It was an ordinary night, except Claire's heart was in turmoil, torn between accepting Alexander's growing role in her life and the lingering fear that she'd end up hurt. When her phone buzzed, she was startled to see Alexander's name lighting up the screen. She picked up hesitantly, half hoping he was just calling to say a friendly hello, and half terrified he might invite her to yet another event she wasn't prepared for. "Hi, Claire," came his gentle voice. "I was wondering, could I drop by? I'd like to show you something." Her instinct was to refuse. She rarely invited anyone outside her close circle to the cramped apartment she shared with her mother and sister. But there was a vulnerability in his tone that echoed her own hidden apprehension. Despite her reservations, she agreed. When he arrived, Megan was already in her bedroom, giving them space. Alexander stepped across the threshold, carefully noting the worn carpet, the second-hand furniture, and the humble family photos on the walls. Claire's cheeks grew warm with embarrassment, but he flashed a small, genuine smile. Then he withdrew an old, battered paperback book from his coat pocket. It was titled Bridging the Divide, Negotiating the Gap Between Rich and Poor. Its edges were dog-eared, and notes were scribbled across its margins. "I read this in college," he said. "It opened my eyes to the differences we all face. I'd like you to read it if you want, and maybe we can talk about it afterward." Claire accepted the book, running her fingers along its worn cover. Her throat felt tight. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, and for the first time she sensed that he might be as uncertain, as vulnerable as she was. Neither of them knew it yet. But that simple exchange was the beginning of an even deeper entanglement. One that would force them to confront the ghosts of their pasts and the realities of their present. In the weeks that followed, a delicate dance unfolded between them. Claire began reading the book Alexander had given her, scribbling questions in the margins. They would meet at the diner before her shift or chat in her apartment parking lot. Conversations that started with small talk often delved into heavier subjects: inequality, the guilt of privilege, and the frustration of feeling trapped by circumstance. Alexander shared stories from his childhood in a struggling Detroit neighborhood, how his parents juggled multiple jobs, and how he once stole food from a convenience store because he was too proud to accept free lunches at school. Claire recounted nights spent waiting for her father to return, the humiliation of rummaging through clearance bins for clothes, and the dread of receiving eviction notices. Their honesty formed a gentle bond, stronger than either had anticipated. Eventually, they found themselves spending Sunday afternoons together. Alexander teaching Claire to drive his Tesla in an empty college parking lot, Claire taking him to a cozy used bookstore she frequented. Each new memory built a fragile bridge between their worlds, one that could easily collapse under the weight of any sudden misstep. Meanwhile, the staff at Rosie's diner looked on with sly grins and curious whispers. Rosie Nicholson occasionally teased Claire, warning her not to let Alexander slip away. The older waitress Tammy offered well-meaning, but not always helpful advice: "Honey, you better lock that man down. If you don't, some other woman will." One day, after hours of inventory and cleaning at the diner, Claire prepared to leave exhausted from a long shift. As she stepped outside, she noticed Alexander waiting by his car. He often picked her up to drive her home, which was a small luxury she was reluctantly growing used to. He opened the passenger door for her and then slid into the driver's seat, where he sat in thoughtful silence. The hum of the engine filled the space, but Alexander didn't put the car in drive. Instead, he turned to face her. "Claire," he began, voice thick with sincerity. "There's something I need to say." Her pulse quickened. The streetlight overhead painted his expression in pale orange hues, accentuating the seriousness in his gaze. "I want you to know that this isn't a game for me," he said slowly, weighing each word. "You have to believe that everything I've shown you, my interest, my feelings, they're all real. I know I haven't been entirely sure how to handle it, because we're from such different worlds. But he paused, gathering courage. "I'm falling for you." Claire felt her heart hammering in her chest as her breath caught. She wanted to respond, but a swarm of conflicting emotions tangled her tongue. A wave of warmth spread through her, but so did an icy tendril of fear. Memories of her father's broken promises resurfaced, the echoes of Mark Ellis's condescending smile, and that anxious feeling of being a charity project or a novelty. "I thank you for being honest," she whispered, eyes lowered. I'm scared. It's hard for me to trust." Alexander exhaled, reaching gently for her hand. "I'm scared too," he admitted. "But we can be scared together, and that maybe is better than being alone." A shaky smile formed on her lips. In that moment, they forged a new level of understanding. Yet neither of them knew that testing times lay ahead, times that would reveal whether this delicate affection could transform into something lasting or shatter under the harsh reality of their differences. With her heart still trembling from Alexander's confession, Claire realized it was time to pull back the curtain on her own life, allowing him to see every corner of her reality. She invited him to meet her mother, Linda Matthews. It happened one Saturday evening when Linda was home between shifts. Claire cooked a simple meal of spaghetti and meatballs, and as the sauce simmered on the stove, she felt her nerves spike at the thought of introducing Alexander to the woman who raised her. When Alexander arrived bearing a bouquet of daisies, Linda's favorite, he immediately drew a warm laugh from the older woman. Linda was both charmed and wary. She'd heard fleeting mentions of Alexander from Claire, but this was the first time she saw the man behind the stories. Over dinner, Linda asked pointed questions about Alexander's background, his family and his plans. He answered candidly, describing how his parents struggled in Detroit, how he poured himself into building his fortune because the memory of hardship haunted him. Linda listened with measured understanding, occasionally trading knowing glances with Claire. When dessert was served, store-bought brownies, as Linda was too tired to bake, a thoughtful hush fell over the small dining table. Surprisingly, Linda was the first to break the silence. "You seem like a good man, Alexander," she said. Slowly, "But I hope you know this family doesn't take kindly to playing games with our hearts. We've been through a lot, especially the girls." Alexander nodded solemnly. "I understand. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't serious." From her seat, Megan piped up with a casual question about cars. She was fascinated by Alexander's Tesla. That seemed to break the tension, and soon the conversation drifted to lighter topics. By the time Alexander left, Linda gave him a reserved nod of acceptance, and Claire felt an inkling of hope stirring inside her. But that hope was tested the next day when Claire received a call from Dr. Halverson, her sister's physician. Megan's condition, an autoimmune disorder, was worsening, and she needed a specialized treatment that insurance only partially covered. The cost was staggering. Claire's mother could hardly manage the out-of-pocket fees on a nurse's salary, and Claire herself could barely keep up with her own expenses. The nights that followed were marked by grim worry calculations that wouldn't add up, and silent tears that dampened her pillow. In her desperation, Claire considered the unthinkable, asking Alexander for financial help. But the idea made her nauseous. She remembered how Mark Ellis and others had looked at her like she was less than them. She didn't want Alexander to think she was using him. Moreover, she didn't want to see a flicker of pity in his eyes. Still, the pressing reality of Megan's health needs weighed heavily. Late one evening, while Alexander was dropping her off at her apartment, she mustered the courage to tell him. She explained Megan's condition, the urgent need for specialized medical treatment, and the glaring financial impossibility. To her surprise, Alexander didn't flinch or step back. He quietly listened, then set his hand gently on her shoulder. "Whatever you need," he said firmly. "I'm here." Claire felt relief mingle with dread. She wanted to trust his intentions, but a haunting thought persisted. If their relationship had been unequal before, it would now be even more complicated. Accepting his help might save Megan, but could it also doom the fragile bond they were building? Despite her inner turmoil, Claire allowed Alexander to help with Megan's medical costs. He arranged a meeting with a specialist at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, someone he'd supported through philanthropic donations, and managed to expedite Megan's evaluation. Though Claire resisted the idea at first, the tangible improvements in her sister's treatment pushed her to swallow her pride. For a while, life seemed to settle into a tenuous peace. With Megan finally receiving better care, Claire relaxed enough to focus on her classes and her budding relationship with Alexander. They took short walks by the lakeside, shared laughter over silly diner anecdotes, and occasionally indulged in a quiet dinner at his penthouse, though Claire still felt out of place amid the sleek modern decor and panoramic city views. Yet just when it seemed like the chasm between them was finally bridging, fate struck back with a dose of cruel irony. One afternoon, as Claire finished her shift, she spotted a woman stepping out of a black limousine. She was tall, impossibly elegant, and looked to be in her mid-30s, hair styled in perfect waves, sporting a Louis Vuitton handbag. To Claire's astonishment, the woman opened the door to Rosie's diner and sat down at a booth, scanning the room as though searching for someone. It didn't take long for that someone to arrive. Alexander entered shortly after, wearing an impeccably tailored suit as usual. Seeing Claire, he offered a smile, but the woman beckoned him over, a slight impatience in her gesture. With a sinking feeling in her chest, Claire observed from behind the counter as Alexander took a seat across from the woman. Their discussion grew animated. The woman occasionally glanced in Claire's direction, narrowing her eyes. At one point, she stood abruptly, handing Alexander a sheaf of documents. Claire couldn't hear their exchange, but she noticed the tension etched across Alexander's face. Before storming out, the woman sneered at Claire, leaving a wave of cold intimidation in her wake. Claire approached Alexander hesitantly. "Is everything okay?" "Who was that?" He rubbed his temple, frustration evident. "That's my ex-fiancée, Veronica Rogers," he admitted. "She wants to invest in one of our upcoming projects, but her conditions are, let's just say, complicated." Claire's heart hammered. Ex-fiancé. She hadn't even realized he'd been engaged before. She tried to ask more, but Alexander quickly changed the subject, his demeanor telling her this was not the time to pry. But it was too late for the seeds of doubt not to take root. The next day, as Claire was about to begin her shift, a well-dressed man in an expensive coat walked in, asked for her by name, and handed her a plain envelope. Confused, she opened it once she was alone, her eyes widening at the single typed page. "Dear Claire, if you truly care about Alexander Wyatt, leave him alone. He needs someone of his status, not a charity case who just wants his money. You're a distraction." Veronica Rogers. Tears burned in Claire's eyes, both from anger and a stinging sense of inadequacy. Everything she'd feared rushed back, the mocking glances, the power imbalance, her father's betrayal. She felt as if the precarious dream she'd been weaving was on the verge of unraveling. Rather than confronting Alexander, she stayed silent. That evening she waited for him to arrive at the diner like he usually did, but her shift ended and he never showed. Later that night, when he finally called, she ignored his calls, struggling to stem the tide of heartbreak that swelled within her. In her mind, the easy narrative formed. She was just a game, a distraction from the real polished women who belonged in his world. Days turned into a tense standoff. Alexander sensed that Claire was pulling away, but each time he tried to broach the subject, she hurried off or found an excuse not to talk. The staff at Rosie's diner watched the shift in their dynamic, with confusion, whispering theories behind the counter. Even Linda noticed her daughter's emotional turmoil at home. But Claire kept her lips sealed, burying her fear of losing the man she had slowly come to love. Then came the day that changed everything. After a long shift, Claire walked out of the diner to find a stretch limousine parked at the curb. She froze, expecting to see Veronica or another one of Alexander's wealthy associates. Instead, it was Mark Ellis who emerged from the driver's seat of all people, beckoning her inside. Against her better judgment, curiosity won out. She slid into the back, finding Alexander sitting there in a crisp suit holding a small velvet box. Her heart pounded so loudly she thought it might drown out all other sound. Without preamble, Alexander reached for her hand. "Claire," he began, "I know these last few days have been tense. I'm not blind. I see the doubt in your eyes." He inhaled deeply, meeting her gaze with an intensity that made the space between them feel electric. "But I need you to know, you're not a game. You're the best part of my life." Her chest tightened. She wanted desperately to believe him. Yet the memory of Veronica's threatening note and that sneer in the diner still haunted her. Then why? He silenced her with a gentle raise of his hand. "I realized that if I don't take a risk now, I might lose you forever." "Claire Matthews." He opened the velvet box, revealing a simple diamond ring that sparkled under the limousine's dim lights. "Will you marry me?" The moment felt surreal, like a scene ripped from a fairy tale. But it was also a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Claire's tears spilled over, but she couldn't even form a smile. Veronica's voice echoed in her head, reminding her she was a mere distraction to Alexander. Memories of her father's broken promises seemed to coil around her heart, suffocating her ability to hope. "I can't," she whispered, her voice breaking. "How can you propose when I can't even be sure? Sure that I'm more than just a passing interest to you?" Alexander looked stunned pain flashing across his face. "Claire, you are everything to me. I've never been more serious about anything in my life." Her throat constricted, the words tumbling out in a sob. "How do I know this isn't just guilt, because you helped my sister, or some fantasy that will fade when you realize I'll never fit in your world?" He reached for her, but she pulled away, her heart shattering in the process. Unable to bear the crush of her fears and insecurities, she fled the limousine. She ran down the dimly lit street, tears streaming, leaving Alexander alone with the ring in his hand. For the next several hours, Claire wandered through the neighborhood, replaying the moment over and over. She'd turned down the proposal of the man she loved, thinking it was the only way to protect herself from a heartbreak that now felt inevitable. For 2 anguished days, Claire turned off her phone, staying holed up in her small bedroom. She couldn't face the reality of what she'd done, rejecting Alexander's proposal. Linda tried to coax her out with hot tea and motherly hugs. Megan, feeling better from her new treatments, offered a few teenage attempts at advice. "He really cares about you, Megan," insisted eyes full of sincerity. But Claire's wounds felt too fresh, too raw. Alexander, for his part, was at a loss. No matter how often he called or texted, he received only silence. He went by the diner, but Rosie firmly told him Claire had taken time off. He was so desperate that he called Linda, pleading for a chance to explain. Moved by his earnestness, Linda agreed to let him come over for dinner one last time. On the 3rd evening, with Claire still locked in her room, there was a gentle knock at the apartment door. Linda ushered Alexander inside, instructing him to wait in the living room. Then she went to Claire's room, quietly urging her daughter to step out. After some reluctance, Claire emerged, eyes red-rimmed and heart pounding. The sight of Alexander's suit, slightly rumpled from days of stress, tugged at her heart. He stood up as she approached, hands trembling at his sides. "I'm sorry to intrude," he said softly, "but I can't let things end the way they did." Claire swallowed hard, a lump of emotion clogging her throat. I didn't know what to believe." Alexander nodded, pain evident in his gaze. "I understand, and I should have been more open. Veronica's note, that was her doing, not mine. I found out she'd threatened you, and I confronted her. She's stepping away from our business deal, because I made it clear I wouldn't tolerate her interference." A faint spark of relief flickered in Claire's chest, but the deeper wound her own insecurities remained. "I'm scared," she whispered, tears brimming again. "I don't belong in your world. I never have." Alexander took a tentative step closer. "My world is nothing without you. And if you feel out of place, I'll be right there with you, guiding, learning, adapting. Or I'll come to your world permanently. All that matters is that we're together." For a long moment, Claire couldn't form words. Then Linda tapped her shoulder lightly, handing her a small bundle of letters Alexander had written over the last 2 days, each detailing his feelings from their first meeting at Rosie's to his hopes for a shared future. The words were heartfelt, vulnerable, and they stilled the maelstrom in Claire's mind. She glanced up at him, tears flowing freely now. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "But I love you." Alexander closed the distance gently, wrapping his arms around her. The tension, the misunderstandings, the heartbreak, they all seemed to melt in that single embrace. She pressed her cheek to his chest, listening to the thud of his heart. A moment later, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the same velvet box, lifting the lid to reveal that solitary diamond ring. This time, Claire didn't run. She recalled all the times he'd proven his sincerity, helping Megan, driving her home, sharing glimpses of his past, defending her against Veronica. In that moment, she realized that true love isn't about matching financial brackets or polished social circles. It's about trust, vulnerability, and a willingness to bridge the gaps no matter how wide. "Yes," she breathed, giving a small, trembling nod. "I'll marry you." Tears of relief glistened in Alexander's eyes as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Linda, standing behind them, gave a teary smile. Megan squealed from the hallway, clapping her hands in glee. Later that night, in the peaceful hush of the living room, Claire and Alexander sat side by side, fingers interwoven. Their journey had been far from smooth, marked by prejudices, misunderstandings, and heartbreak. But in that quiet moment, they knew the hardships had molded them, proving that what they shared was stronger than any difference that might threaten to tear them apart. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey, where a humble waitress overcame her fears and a guarded millionaire surrendered his pride to find true love. If you found inspiration or even shed a tear along the way, don't forget to show your support. Give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who loves a good romance, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us of the power of hope and genuine human connection. When we witness love bridging gaps, be they social, financial, or emotional, we're reminded that vulnerability and honesty are the real catalysts for transformation. By embracing your dreams and confronting your insecurities, you too can discover profound love and self-growth. If Claire and Alexander's story touched your heart, please let us know in the comments. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.